Lexi and Dylan. We're up to now part 4 of the Jonathan Livingston Seagull storybook. Wow, isn't it exciting? For a few years after Jonathan Seagull vanished from the beaches of the flock, it was the strangest bunch of birds that have ever lived on Earth. Many of them had actually begun to understand the message he had brought, and it was as common to see a young gull flying upside down and practicing loops as it was to see an old one. Unwilling to open his eyes to the glory of flying, boring straight and level out to the fishing boats, hoping for a supper of soggy bread. Fletcher, Len Seagull, and the other students of Johnathan spread their instructors' teaching of freedom and flight in long missionary journeys to every flock on the coastline. There were remarkable events in those days. Fletcher's own students and students of their students were flying with precision and a kind of joy that had never been seen before. Here and there were individual birds who flew aerobatics as they practiced, better than Fletcher, sometimes better even than Johnathan himself had flown them. The learning curve of a highly motivated seagull goes on steeply off the top of any graph, and now and then there were students who overcame limits so perfectly that they disappeared, as Johnathan had, from the face of an earth too limited to contain them. It was a golden age for a while. Crowds of gulls elbowed in upon Fletcher to touch the one who had touched Jonathan Seagull, a bird they now considered divine. In vain did Fletcher insist that Jonathan had been a gull like them all, who had learned as they all could learn. They were after him constantly to hear Jonathan's exact words, his precise gestures, to find tiny details about him. The more they begged for trivia, the more uneasy Fletcher Gull grew. When once they had been interested in practicing the message, training and flying fast and free and glorious in the sky, now they began to slack away from difficult work and became ever so slightly wide-eyed over legends of Johnathan, as though he were the idol of a fan club. Gull Fletcher, they asked, did the magnificent Johnathan say, we are in truth the ideas of the great gull, or was it, we are in fact the ideas of the great gull? Please, call me Fletcher, just Fletcher Seagull, he would reply. Appalled they would use a term of reverence upon him, and what difference does it make which word he used? Both are correct. We are ideas of the great gull, but he knew they were not satisfied with his answer. They thought he had dodged their question. Gull Fletcher, when the divine gull Johnathan rose to fly, did he move one step toward the wind or two? Before he could correct the one question, another was fired. Gull Fletcher, did the sacred gull Johnathan have grey eyes or golden eyes? The question of a bird with grey eyes was in anguish for one answer only. I don't know, I forget his eyes. He had purple eyes. How can that matter? What he came to tell us was that we can fly if we would just wake up and stop standing around on the beach talking about the colour of somebody's eyes. Now watch, and I'll show you a pinwheel turn. But more than one gull, finding it weary to practice something as difficult as a pinwheel, flew home musing. The great one had purple eyes, not like my eyes, not like the eyes of any gull that ever lived. The class changed within years from wide soaring poems in flight to hushed talk about Jonathan before and after practice to long involved recitations on the sand about the Divine One, with no flying ever done by anybody. Fletcher and the other students of Johnathan were at turns puzzled and correctful and firm and furious at the change, but they were helpless to stop it. They were honoured and worst, revered, but they were no longer heard, and the birds who practiced flying were fewer and fewer. One by one, the original students passed away, leaving cold dead bodies behind them. The flock, seizing upon the bodies, held great tearful ceremonies over them, burying them under enormous cairns of pebbles, each pebble laid in place after a long, sorrowing sermon by a deadly solemn bird. The Khans became shrines, and it was a required ritual for every gull who wishes oneness to drop a pebble and a doleful speech upon the Khan. No one knew that oneness was, but it was such a deep thing that a gull could never ask without being thought a fool. Why? Everyone knows what oneness is, and the prettier the pebble you drop on the gull martin's tomb, the better your chance of getting there. Fletcher passed away last of all. It happened during a long, lonely session of the purest, most beautiful flying he had ever done. His body vanished in the midst of a long, vertical, slow roll, something he had practiced since he had first met Johnathan Seagul. And when he vanished, he was not setting pebbles or meditating over slogans of oneness. He was lost in the perfection of his own flight. When Fletcher didn't show up at the beach in the next week, when he vanished without leaving a note, the flock was in brief consternation. Isn't that beautiful? But they gathered together and thought and decided what must have happened. It was announced that the gull Fletcher had been seen, surrounded by the other 7 first students, standing on what would henceforth be known as the Rock of Oneness. And then the clouds had parted, and the great gull, Johnathan Livingston Seagull himself, clad in royal plumes and golden shells, with a crown of precious pebbles upon his brow, pointing symbolically to the sky and sea and wind and earth, had called him up to the beach of oneness, and Fletcher had magically risen, surrounded by holy rays, and the clouds had closed again over the scene to a great chorus of gull voices singing. That's not what happened. That's what they've decided is going to be the story they tell that's happened, eh? And so the pile of pebbles on the Rock of Oneness, in sacred memory of Gull Fletcher, was the biggest pile of pebbles on any coastline anywhere on Earth. Other piles were built everywhere in replica, and every Tuesday afternoon the flock would walk over to stand around the pebbles and hear the miracles of Johnathan Livingston Seagull and his gifted divine students. Nobody did any more flying than was absolutely necessary, and when it was necessary, they grew strange customs about it. As a kind of status symbol, the more affluent birds began carrying branches from trees in their beaks. The larger and heavier the branch a gull carried, the more attention he earned in the flock. The larger the branch, the more progressive a flyer he was considered. A few in the Gull Society noticed that by carrying the weight and drag of the branches around with them, the most faithful seagulls became disturbing flyers. The symbol for Johnathan teaching became a smooth pebble, then later any old rock would do. It was the worst possible symbol for a bird who had come to teach the joy of flight, but nobody seemed to notice, at least nobody who mattered in the flock. On Tuesdays, all flying stopped and a listless crowd gathered to stand and hear the official flock student recite. In a matter of only a few years, the recitation stratified and hardened into granite dogma. Ho Jonath Galak, great Galak, Wanath, have pity on who we are, lower than sand fleas. On and on for hours came Tuesdays. It was a mark of excellence for the officials to run the sounds together rapid fire so they couldn't be recognized as words at all. A few insolent birds whispered that the sound meant nothing anyway, even if one could eventually figure out that there was in fact a word or two buried within it. Images of Johnathan pecked from sandstone set with great sad purple shell eyes sprung up all along the coastline at every cairn and replica cairn, sent us to a worshipper heavier than rocks could symbolize. In less than 200 years, every element of Johnathan's teaching was taken out of daily practice by the simple pronouncement that it was holy and beyond the aspiration of common gulls lower than sand fleas. In time, the rites and ceremonies that were planted around the name of Johnathan Seagull became obsessive. Any thinking gull altered course in the air, so not even fly inside of the cairns, built as they were on the ceremony, and superstition of those who preferred excuses for failure instead of hard work and greatness. The thinking gulls paradoxically closed their minds at the sound of certain words: flight, cairn, great gull, Johnathan. On all other matters they were the most lucid, honest birds since Johnathan himself, but the mention of his name or any other term so badly mauled by the official local students, their minds snapped shut with the sound of trapping doors. Because they were curious, they began experimenting with flight, though they never used that word. It's not flight, they assured themselves over again. It's just a way of finding what's true. So in rejecting the students, they became students themselves. In rejecting the name of Johnathan Seagul, they practiced the message he had brought to the flock. This was no noisy resolution. There was no revolution. There was no shouting, no waving of banners. But individuals like Anthony Seagul, for instance, not fully grown to the feathers of adulthood, began asking questions. Wow. Okay. I love you, babies. Catch up with you tomorrow. We'll continue the story. Bye.